Welcome, everyone, to another random walk down Mill Street. Tonight's topic are the Millstones in the lobby of Shearith, Israel. Thank you, Vivette. I assume, although I should not assume anything, that if you have been to the synagogue, you will know what millstones I am talking about. You will have seen them in the lobby or the vestibule right in front of the main sanctuary. The starting point for this talk, or this presentation tonight, is what are they? Why are they in the vestibule of the synagogue? The lore of the congregation is that they come from the old mill in which the original Jews of New Amsterdam, who arrived in 1654, prayed before they had a synagogue. And we'll see that's part of that is probably true, part of that is probably false, but they are real, very, very old relics of New Amsterdam, sitting here pretty much undiscovered by most of New York, and underappreciated by people who pass by them all the time. When I give tours, I usually point them out as I walk from the small synagogue to the large synagogue, the large sanctuary, and I tell people that this is some of the oldest objects in New York City history sitting right here in our lobby. And sometimes we'll have events in the synagogue or a bar mitzvah or a wedding or something, and people will put their champagne glass right down on those stones because it's a nice little flat place to put something. But yeah, they don't realize that they're just putting something on the some of the oldest objects in New York City history. And so that's what I want to talk to you about tonight. So I'm going to share my screen, and some of you may know this already. I haven't done any original research here. This is all coming from things that have been published already. So I apologize for those of you who are deeply invested in this topic. But here we go. Nope, this is the wrong thing. Okay, let's get my... Okay, here it is. Okay, just thumbs up if you can see my screen is shared. Great, thank you. Okay, Shearith Israel's Millstones, Remnants of New Amsterdam. So if you haven't seen them before, this is what we're talking about. This is just a picture of the millstones in front of the synagogue. To the left and to the right of this photograph are doors that lead to the main sanctuary. And you can see these are two millstones that are resting on a wooden base. And so that's what we're talking about. There is a little plaque in here which says that these are two millstones, French burr millstones, which we're going to explain what that means. Which come from the first mill that made flour in the colony of New Amsterdam. But I just want to, before we really get into those stones themselves, just talk about flour, making of flour in Old New Amsterdam. This is the seal of the city of New York. And it was adopted actually in the British period. And you can see here that the seal has a windmill, depiction of a windmill, depiction of beavers, because New York was a fur trading hub, and these barrels, which I believe go connected with the windmill, which means that the windmill the mills created flour, and flour was kept in the barrels. And New York was actually in the colonial period, or at least in the early colonial period, in the Dutch period, and the early British period, an exporter of flour. Flour, wheat, and other grains were grown relatively locally in the Northeast, and they were brought to places where they could be ground into flour and shipped off elsewhere. And one of the main places for that was what we call New York City, or originally New Amsterdam. And so that was one of the major businesses that was engaged in. One of the export businesses from New York and New Amsterdam was flour. And you can see that this is the seal as it was today with an eagle, but originally it had British crown, if you can see on the right here. I don't know if you can see that or not. This is the original seal from 1686. There are actually even earlier versions that are a little different, but this is a pretty old seal showing that milling and flour production were integral to the identity of New York, going back to a very old period, in case you were wondering. And if you were to have taken a boat into New Amsterdam during the Dutch period or the early British period, you would have seen two windmills in the skyline. And here, in fact, you can even see one of them. The other would be off to your right. From a view of New York that was made in 1664, there is a windmill right over here to the left, to the west of the island. So there were two windmills that were known. Some people say three in Old New Amsterdam. And here is a picture of where one of them was, which was next to the old fort. The customs house is essentially where the old fort was. And this was a windmill that created a wind-powered grist mill making flour. There was also a sawmill creating lumber. And there was another mill from probably a little later, or a little bit unclear, in the 1630s, off towards the South Street Seaport area to the west. So just a little background of how a windmill or any mill really works, grist mill in particular. This is a depiction of a water mill, but it works essentially the same. Instead of having the power from the water down here, you would have had this crank being turned by the windmill on the top. But same idea, this central crank gets turned by the power created by the mill itself, and as all connected to each other, there is grain put in this bin up here that gets shaken as the I don't know what you call those, the tines of the mill turn, shaking grain down into this actual mill, which has two stones, a top and an upper and a bottom. The whole grains go in. The crank is also connected to another shaft here that goes into the stones themselves. One of the stones is stationary, one of the stones turns, it grinds the flour, which then gets taken down to a third level below where the flour is collected and bagged and taken out for export. So that's the way flour mills work. Not even that different today or even into the modern period. Obviously the technology changes, but the idea is the same. You have it goes from up down, using gravity, it goes from the top down. And so the point that I'm trying to make here is that flour mills had multiple levels. And so when you hear, or I'll tell you now, the first mill in New York was actually a horse-drawn mill that was built in 1626, 1628. And on the upper level of that mill, worshiped the Dutch Reformed Church before they actually had their first church building. The horse and the mill operations ceased on Sunday, the Christian Sabbath day, and they had services in the upper level. As you can see, there is some room to do so because there is not a whole lot other than a bin holding grain. There's not a lot of stuff on that upper level. So before I get to this is really the meat of it. The story is, and this part is, I think, completely fictional, that the Dutch Reformed Church, this part is true. The Dutch Reformed Church worshipped in the old grist mill, which was a horse-drawn mill in Old New Amsterdam in the late 1620s, early 1630s, till they had their own church building when they moved out of the mill and worshipped in their own church. Then 25, 30 years later, in 1654, as we know well, Jews arrive along with Dutch Protestants who are escaping Recife, Brazil, from the Portuguese who have just taken over Pernambuco. And they get stranded here, hold back and forth with the Dutch West India Company. Ultimately, they're given permission to stay. and the Jewish community of Amsterdam decides to make a go of having a Jewish community in New Amsterdam. And in 1655, they send a Torah scroll, and other settlers come, and the community of New Amsterdam, the Jewish community of New Amsterdam, takes off. It is said that the Dutch minister, I forgot his name, Polhemus, I think was his name, who was on the boat with the 23 Jews from Brazil who arrived in 1654, arranged for the Jews to worship in the same place that the Dutch had originally worshipped 30 years earlier, 25 years earlier, on the upper floor of the old mill, before there was a Mill Street synagogue, before there was any kind of synagogue worship. That he arranged for that. That part is completely apocryphal. There is no source for that. There's no written evidence that the Jews worshipped in the old mill. But what there is the location of the first synagogue, which, as you know, was on Mill Street, hence we call it the Mill Street Synagogue. And even before the Mill Street Synagogue was built, there was a rented house, which was essentially on the other side of Mill Street, on Beaver Street, which was, below was Mill Street, above was Beaver Street, in almost the same location, just down the block, essentially, from the Mill Street Synagogue, which would later be built in 1730. But before around 1695, which is when we first get reference to a synagogue, the Jew synagogue, they did not have a synagogue. They worshipped in private homes. They were not permitted to have a synagogue. They were not permitted to have public worship. And we know that from the Dutch period, and we know that even from the British period. And so it's exceedingly unlikely that there would have been permission granted for the Jews to have a public service in the mill when they were not allowed to have public worship in any form. They had to keep it private. So I think the story of the Jews worshiping in the old mill is just a story. But other parts of this story we'll see are true. So how did these millstones coming from the old mill get to our synagogue? And that story is interesting, and that's what we're going to talk about today. I have two depictions of the same story. They basically dovetail each other, but each one has a little more color. Each one has different colors, so we're going to read both of them. This first one is from a writing in I think in 1918 or in 1928 from a journal called Scenic America, which was an old, nowadays we would call it preservation kind of effort. This was a journal that was dedicated to preserving old sites in America. And they have a write-up about the Jewish community and the first synagogue. And in that article is these two columns that we're going to read, all about the millstones. So we'll just read it. After the mill, so it's talking about there was an old mill that was on the street called Mill Street. Mill Street was not its original name. Mill Street was first originally called like Slop Street or something else in Dutch, because there was a waterway there that they would throw refuse in. Later on, it became a street, but that's where the old mill was located, and it ends up being called Mill Street during the British period, not during the Dutch period, during the British period. I think it was called Slick Street in the Dutch period. Today we call it South William Street. But after that old mill fell into disuse, and here we're going to 16 heavy millstones were left on the site, which later became the rear yard of the Mill Street Synagogue, which was Shearith Israel's first synagogue location. 2 of them were kept by the congregation in its changes of location and are now to be seen in the entrance of the synagogue on Central Park West. That's what you saw earlier and what you see when you come to the synagogue. 2 others, taken from the rear of number 40 Beaver Street, where they were used as pavement for a courtyard after the Great Fire of 1835, are preserved by the Collegiate Church of St. Nicholas. In case you were wondering what the Collegiate Church of St. Nicholas was, this was a very large Dutch Reformed church that was located in Rockefeller Center until about 1947, 1948. It was built in, I think the 1860s or the 1870s. The Dutch Reformed Church is interesting. They're called collegiate because, and I think this goes back to 1654, when the minister, he has another name, Domine or something like that, Polhemus, arrives. There suddenly are more than one minister for this community. And so the leaders of the Dutch Reformed Church in New York became colleagues of one another, and the church's name became the Collegiate Church because it had multiple ministers leading it, and that became known as the Collegiate Church. They exist today. They are one of the biggest churches in New York. They have at least 4 locations. One of them is on the Upper West Side, the West Side Collegiate Church. One of them is in Washington Heights. I think there's one in Brooklyn. And if I'm not mistaken, Trinity Church down in Lower Manhattan is also part of the Dutch Reformed. I could be wrong. They might be Anglican. But anyway, the Dutch Reformed Church is the oldest established church in New York City. And so there were millstones in their flagship church building, which was in Rockefeller Center until 1947, when it got torn down. And as we'll see later, those stones are still extant today on the Upper West Side. So here we go. 2 of them are preserved in the Collegiate Church of St. Nicholas, whose earliest congregation, according to traditions, met in the loft of the mill where the stones were used about 1626. This is probably true because there is a writing from the minister who says that they worshipped in the loft above the old mill. And according to this tradition, the first Jews in New York worshipped in the same mill loft. As we saw, I don't think that is likely to be true. The preservation of the 2 millstones now in the synagogue was due to the interest of Captain N. Taylor Phillips, who was for 20 years the treasurer and trustee of the American Scenic and Historic Preservation Society. That's the society I mentioned earlier, and that's where this publication comes from. And the trustee of the congregation. This is Captain Phillips of we'll talk about him we'll devote another class to him probably. The attention of Captain Phillips's father, Isaac Phillips, who you see here, was attracted to the stones by an article by Albion M. Dyer in the publication of the American Jewish Historical Society in 1894. Now, this is very interesting because Albion M. Dyer was not a Jewish person at all, but he did come from an old New York family, and he was a very prodigious writer in the late 19th century and historian. And he was a member of all sorts of historical societies and a prominent member of the New York Historical Society on Central Park West and 76th Street. And so he wrote an article about the location of the first synagogue in the New Journal of the American Jewish Historical Society, which was not very old. It was one of the first issues in 1894, where he talks about the mill and the Mill Street Synagogue and these millstones. Captain Phillips had business relations with the owners of the property at 44 Beaver Street, in the rear yard of which some of the stones remained. He verified the authenticity of these 300-year-old stones through a stone mason who was over 90 years of age, who recalled when they were on the property of the Mill Street Synagogue, and who laid them in the pavement when they were part of the city was rebuilt after the fire of 1830. Captain Phillips was given the millstones and had them removed to the synagogue of Shearith, Israel in 19th Street, before the current building, and then they were transferred in 1897 to the present edifice. So that's the story. That's where those stones come from. They were in the backyard of the Mill Street Synagogue and forgotten about when the congregation moved from that location. They ended up being placed in the pavement of the street. And then, as a result of an article by this fellow Dyer, Captain Phillips, or Captain Phillips's father, said, hey, where are those? Let's go take a look at them, and got permission to remove them and brought them to the synagogue. The same essential story is written, by the way, this is a great photograph. I don't know if anyone noticed what he's wearing here. This is Isaac Phillips. This is the son of Naphtali Phillips, the grandson of Jonas Phillips. All of these people could have whole presentations written about them. Isaac Phillips was the Grand Master. I don't mean a Grand Master. He was the Grand Master of the Freemasons Lodge of New York for a long period. And so he's wearing his regalia here. He was the top Mason in New York. And so he deserves a whole story about himself. But this is a great photograph showing him in his Mason regalia with his belt and whatever, tool belt and other things here. Now, his son, Isaac Phillips' son, was Captain Naphtali Taylor Phillips, who was an officer of the synagogue and who was responsible for moving these millstones to the synagogue. The same story essentially is written about by Captain Phillips himself in reminiscences that he gave here at the synagogue in 1927 and which were published as part of the Tercentenary by the American Jewish Archives in 1954. And so we'll just read it because it has a little more color than the other story. It is a very curious incident that the stones from that mill, which we mentioned earlier, are the stones which you see upstairs in the entrance to the synagogue on 70th Street. I will tell you a bit about those stones because I had something to do with their being taken from the site on South William Street to the synagogue on 19th Street in 1894. And here is a picture of Captain N. Taylor Phillips in 1954. This was, if you take a look, you can see Edgar J. Nathan III. I think I saw Ruth Nathan was watching. I hope she is. Edgar Nathan was the president of the congregation, or at this point, I think this was before he was the president of the congregation. But Captain Phillips was the old grandee when they had the Tercentenary, and he was honored with opening the doors of the synagogue for that special service, which was held for the 300th anniversary of the congregation. And here's a picture of him doing just that. And so this is Captain Phillips, who we're reading his words right now. Okay, I see some comments, which I'll have to look at in a minute. So he says that I remember when I was a boy. This is Captain Phillips, who was born in 1868. I remember when I was a boy hearing my father say that he remembered the first synagogue erected by the congregation in 1730. Isaac Phillips was alive when the first Mill Street Synagogue was still standing, although when he was very young, in his childhood, in 1818, it was torn down and a second Mill Street Synagogue built in its place. But he was a child, probably of 5 or 6 or 7, when that happened. And so this is his reminiscences from his youth. And in the yard of that synagogue on Mill Street, when he was a boy, there were stacked up a great number of millstones, which had belonged to the mill on whose site the synagogue was subsequently erected. I heard that and never thought anything of it. Then in 1894, I met a man who was a considerable writer, Mr. Albion Dyer, and he had been on several New York newspapers and had written extensively for magazines. He came to my office one day, and we began discussing the synagogue and other matters. And he asked me if I had ever seen the millstones, which were in the yard of the rear of the old business buildings on south side of Beaver Street, east of Broad. I told him I had never seen them. So he took me around there, and through the courtesy of the people who owned the building, showed them to me. Those stones were then in the pavement, forming a part of the pavement of the yard. And I knew that they were the stones that had belonged to the mill. Unquestionably, they were the stones that I had heard had been stacked up in the yard behind the synagogue. Subsequently, Mr. Dyer found a man who was 90 to 100 years old, who had assisted in the laying of those stones in the yard in the year 1835 after the Great Fire in New York City. Although the synagogue had moved to Crosby Street by then, after the fire, the present buildings that are there now, he's writing in 1927, were built. And this man, this old 90-year-old man, had participated in laying those millstones in making the pavement instead of stacking them up as they had previously been. I merely mention that to show the very direct contact. After all, I saw the man who laid these stones that had stood in that yard, which had been there since 1628. So, yeah, another unbelievable thing where the generation, only a few generations get you back to New Amsterdam history. Just a few generations, and suddenly those stones are alive in some fashion. And what he doesn't write here is that Captain Phillips arranged for the business, which was something called the U.S. Realty and I forgot the full name of the business on Beaver Street, which had the building behind which these stones were embedded in the pavement. He got them to donate them, some to the synagogue, some to the collegiate church, and some to the New York Historical Society. And so that is the story of those stones. But I do have some more things for you to see, because when you dig deeper, you can learn a lot. So in the Museum of the City of New York, there is they have a photograph of those stones as they were in the pavement in the backyard of Mill Lane and Beaver Street. Mill Lane crosses South William Street, and here is these are the stones, and you can see them right here as used in pavement. By 1894, they're gone. So this is they describe it as circa 1890, but yeah, it has to be before 1894. This picture, because 1894 they dug them up and divvied them up. Yeah. So I thought this is a pretty great photograph. You can see them where they were originally. And here in 2014, I went to the West End Collegiate Church, which is on 77th and West End Avenue. If you know anyone who went to Collegiate High School, that's exactly the same location, the West End Collegiate Church. And I visited with them, and in their vestibule, they have 3 of those stones. We have 2, they have 3. In fact, they actually have 4, because there is a 4th one that is somehow embedded in the wall on the other side of the church, which you can't really see anymore because they've built a building there, but apparently used to be visible on West End Avenue between 77th and 78th Street. And these are the stones that were originally in the church that was in Rockefeller Center, or near Rockefeller Center, that was moved when that building was sold in 1947 to this location here on 77th Street. And if you take a look at the West End Collegiate Church website, which I did today, they actually tell you right on when you look at the history of the church, we trace our origins to a loft above a grist mill in New Amsterdam in 1628. Dutch settlers worshipped there before the first permanent church was built in 1642. The millstones from that mill can be seen in the vestibule of our church, pretty prominently displayed. And what they don't say is that Captain Phillips is the one who got them for them. And here is another millstone from the same lot in the New York Historical Society. Now, they inaccurately describe it as South Street, but it's actually South William Street that this comes from. And that causes all sorts of problems for other reasons, but this is actually from South William Street. And the reason I know for sure is because it was a gift of the U.S. Realty and Improvement Company, which is the same company that owned the property on Beaver Street, which Captain Phillips arranged to have them removed from. So for sure, this is an error here. But it dates to the original flour mill, which made flour for New Amsterdam. They look exactly the same as ours. And today, just to be sure, I measured the millstone here in the synagogue. It's exactly the same measurements. I would have said 30 inches, but 29.5 is pretty close, and 6 inches wide. So they are exactly the same as the ones that we have in the synagogue. They actually have 2. The only one is pictured here. I think that might be my last slide. Let's take a look. Oh, one more. Here they are today, and here's our previous Shamash, Arthur Tenenholtz, with the millstones right here that you can see them today. If you read what's written here, it says that these were not French burr millstones that were imported in 1627. Rather, they were British millstones imported in 16 65. I asked the person who was responsible for this copy, and he did not remember where he got that from. And my research, I don't know where that piece of information came from, and I tend to doubt it actually, because these stones came from a different location than the stones that were imported in 1664. But I'll leave that to for another day. That's my presentation for you. I'm going to stop my share, take a look at what you have written to me here in the chat. Okay. Trinity Church was Anglican. Okay, so I got that wrong. But there are, yeah, I'd say Norman Vincent Peale's church was on 5th Avenue and 29th Street is a collegiate church. So yeah, I think there are 4 collegiate churches. If you go to their website, you can see where they are. I know for sure one of them is in Washington Heights and one of them is on the west side. Maybe the one on 29th Street is also, and I think there might be one in Brooklyn. And I'm going to stop the recording and permit you all to ask and speak. And let's do that first, actually. Okay.